All right, hi guys. We're gonna go ahead and get started. It's 10 after, so we're just gonna go ahead and get started. Smaller crowd, but we'll seems pretty nice and chill. Make sure you signed into the event. Go to the link tree to make if you haven't yet to sign in. We need to make sure we keep accurate attendance. So a couple quick announcements, kind of the same things, except with a little bit extra information. We have the collaborative hackathon between the College of Engineering and Computer Science and the College of Business Administration to help promote the new Masters in FinTech program that's starting this fall. These are the three themes for the hackathon. It is a month-long hackathon starting in like less than in about 2 weeks, I'd say. Yeah, March 8th. Yeah, so March 8th from April 10th. Registration for the event will remain open. And if you want to let us know you're going, you can fill out our form on the link tree, so we can best support you in this. If you want to be in the top, considered for one of the top 10 teams to present at a summit or to attend a summit with a lot of important people going to that event, you gotta make sure your team is only UCF people. So please let us know if you're interested or if you're going. And we just got word of some events that they're going to start hosting leading up to the event, because these are focused on some of the themes that they have for the event. So on Tuesday, March 1st, they're going to have Women in FinTech with Willa. On Wednesday, March 2nd, they're going to have an introduction to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And then on Thursday, they're going to have introduction to banking as a service and embedded finance. So this goes back to these three themes that we saw at the beginning: sustainability, inclusive finance, embedded finance, and decentralized finance. So if you kind of want some more background on those things leading up to the event, these are the events for you. I already put the signups, the registrations on the link tree. So you just scroll down a little bit and you'll see each link for each day. So I definitely would, I looked at the people who are running these events. These are founders, these are CEOs, these are like pretty cool people who are actually hosting these events. So it could also be a good networking opportunity to attend these events. So here, there's a dev post, Hack to the Future. That's the name of the hackathon. Thursday meetings at 5. Not sure what we're doing next week yet. Since it's the Thursday before spring break, we might do something a little bit more casual, a little bit more relaxed. Keep an eye on that announcement. Cave every Friday, except for next Friday, because we're pretty sure y'all gonna clock out for spring break next Friday. But tomorrow from 1 p.m. to 3 p.m., there will be pizza and drinks tomorrow. So just come hang out with us. Projects teams will be meeting. Overall fun time. Might bring a game or two. Lots of things to do: social events, food trips, the cave, weekly operations meetings. And then we still have just a couple more positions that are open that we're still interviewing for. We are going to start cutting off the interviews soon. We've already filled, I'd say, most of the really importantly needed positions, but we could still potentially use project directors. We definitely need a sponsorship director, and then we have other openings as well. Dues. I already asked the room if anyone wanted to pay in person, but if you want to be a member, dues paying or not, fill out the form on the link tree, and you can pay with a debit card at nighthacks.org/dues or Cash App $nighthacks. Just make sure you include your Cash App tag in the form in step 1. You can still submit your resume to our sponsors, so that's going to be on our link tree. I thought we still had the raffle. I thought we still had the raffle open, right? We're doing that until like right before spring break. Sure. Yeah, so as soon as spring break starts, we're going to announce the winners of the raffle. So you still have an opportunity to give this information. We're giving away 3 $10 Amazon gift cards. So literally just giving your resume can put you in the winning for that. And I have something in chat. What's up? Oh, okay. Just from earlier. Hey, Rob, work until 5:30. Got you. Nice. Okie dokie. So without further ado, back to Eli for the part 2 of the Chrome extension workshop.
All right. Super exciting stuff. So how many of you guys were here last week? Just show of hands. All right. I know Karan wasn't here. Okay, so almost everyone. So for those of you here last week, we're going to do the same kind of structure we did, where we're going to introduce a project at the beginning and then work through the project, kind of introduce some cool things that you can do with the Chrome API. For those of you who weren't here last week, we're going to start from scratch again. So everything that you see, I will go ahead and explain some of it a little bit less in detail than I did last week, just so we can actually finish. I do expect that this is going to run until at least 6:30, probably a little bit later, just because there's a little bit more content than last week. But we're going to introduce some really cool things that I didn't talk about, and then also just some helpful things that you can use when you're developing an extension or a website to help you with debugging. So that being said, might as well jump right into it, which means I can figure out how to close this. I'm going to start by demoing the project that we're going to make. So last week, I just kind of started building it, and I didn't tell you what we were going to make. I would like everyone to be able to see what we're going to do so that you can understand the design decisions that we're making. So if I go to just a random website here, we'll start with web courses. What we're going to make today is we're going to make an extension that enforces dark mode on any site that you go to. So lots of sites have a dark mode built into them, but also lots of them don't. Web courses, for example, as far as I know, does not have a dark mode. And we're going to build an extension that literally goes in and modifies all the pages you go to and turns them into dark mode. And the way we're going to do that is primarily through the use of content scripts. So at the very end of last week, Rob asked a really good question about whether you can actually modify the content within the page rather than modifying like the actual browser. Because what we did last week is we kind of listened for where the browser was going and then sent them to a new place. Instead, today we're going to mostly focus on interacting with the page itself. Lots of really cool things that we can do with that, and you'll see many of them very shortly. So basically, we can just toggle our dark mode on and off. And if we turn it on, it basically turns everything on the page into dark mode. And if we navigate within the same page, you'll see some things are not dark just because this is being loaded in after we've already applied. So one thing that I wanted to do today is also include an options page, which we didn't do last week, where we can set a couple of things on here. And now with that selected, if I, hold on, that should have done something, but it appears to not have done anything. So if we now go in here and we, okay. So now what happens basically is if we have something that's left not dark mode, we can click on the page anywhere and it will reapply everything again, just in case there's something that loads in late. So a couple of options we'll do. And that's pretty much it. So we might as well go ahead and get started. Don't want to waste any more time here. I'm going to actually go ahead and remove this extension just so that we can reload it again later. Remove. Okay, and we're going to start from scratch. So if you have a laptop, pull it out. If you have an IDE, pull that out as well. If you have Chrome, get ready to load it up. And we're going to go ahead and start a new project. So you can put that project anywhere you want. I'm going to do it in my projects folder. I'm going to call it Dark Mode Enforcer. And then I'll go ahead and load that up in my IDE of choice, which is, of course, as usual, VS Code. And we're going to once again create all the files that are required for a Chrome extension. So first couple things is we need to create the folders we want. So we need a source folder where we're going to put all of our JavaScript to actually make things happen on the extension. We need an HTML folder because we're going to have a couple of HTML views. That is a file, not a folder. Come on. Yes, absolutely. Okay, actually we'll zoom in one more there. If it's still too small, just let me know. So source folder, we need an HTML folder. One thing we did last week is we put our stylings for our HTML page directly into the page in the header tag. We're gonna do it a little differently just for fun this week. So we're also gonna create a CSS folder and link to it dynamically, which I'll talk about in a second. And then, of course, the one thing that is the most important for any Chrome extension is a manifest file, manifest.json. So once again, JavaScript object notation, that's what JSON stands for. And basically, JSON just means a set of curly braces, and then we have key value pairs inside of it to define all the things that we want to put on our extension. So the first thing we're going to put in here is we're going to put in a name for our extension, which we said was Dark Mode Enforcer. And any property other than the last one needs a comma after it. We're also going to put in a description here, and that description can be anything. So we're going to just talk about what it does. So turns everything in the page to dark mode dynamically. Okay. And then we need a version. just so that Chrome knows what version we want, and we'll start with 1.0.0. Why is this turning it on to a new line? That doesn't make any sense. All right, we're gonna leave it because I think that's auto formatting. All right, and then we also need our manifest version just to tell it what version of the Chrome API we're using, and we're gonna use version 3, which is the same thing we did. And then we're also gonna go through all the other things that we need in here. So we need to figure out what permissions does our Chrome extension have access to. And of course, because it's lots of permissions, that is an array. And last week we used the storage permission. We're going to take full advantage of that once again. But the other, we also used the web navigation permission last week. We're not going to use that. There aren't any actually other permissions that we need here. There'll be more things we have to define that we didn't define last week, but we'll talk about those when we get there. Okay, so once again, if we go in here and have our extensions loaded up here, anytime we click on the icon here, basically a pop-up comes up and we can define what we want to pop up through an HTML page that just gets downsized into a little pop-up here. So we need to define that as well. The way we do that is defining an action for when that button is clicked, what action is performed. And our action is going to have a default pop-up. And we're going to name this pop-up pop-up.html. And we need to specify which folder it's in. And it's going to be in the /html/popup.html. So any path that we write in JavaScript has to start with the slash here. I spelled this incorrectly. Don't do what I do. All right, and then we also need to specify what icon do we want to use in that little top bar there to bring things onto the browser. So once again, we do that. We have to define all of the icons we want to use, and icons can be different sizes depending on where they're being used. So we need to define a 48 by 48 icon and also a 128 by 128 pixel icon. So those get used in different places. Those are the only two that are required. And I have made those available for you on nighthacks.org/linktree once again. Just to make things a little bit simpler, we're going to go to workshop assets here. And if you ever get behind on where we are, raise your hand. There's not very many of you, so we can obviously pause and slow down. But we also have the full workshop code in there, so you can catch up and copy anything you need. So if you click the assets link, it'll bring up assets.zip, and we're going to download this zip file. There's a couple things in here. The two that are the most important are the icons. So we're just going to open up the zip file and go find our project once again. Projects, Dark Mode Enforcer. We need to create an assets folder in here. That's where all of our assets are going to go, and we'll paste everything in. So we have our two icons, icon 48 and icon 128. We also have something in here called tinycolor.js. So as I was going through this and trying to come up with, how are we actually going to make this happen? I found this other really cool library that helps a lot with determining if colors are light or dark and making them lighter or darker, but keeping them the same color. So I also provided that for you. We're going to copy that out from the assets folder and put that into our source folder, since that's where we're going to put all of our JavaScript. Okay, so we did that. All of our assets should be loaded in here. Is anyone still working on that? Should I pause for anyone? Okay, so now that we have those loaded in, we can specify where they are. They are in the assets folder. And this is icon48.png. And this one down here is icon128.png. Okay, super cool. So now we've defined our action, and it's going to bring up that pop-up, and we'll demo that in a second. We also need to specify our icons for the Chrome extension itself. So those icons only apply to that little thing in the top bar, but we also need to define icons that show up when we go into our extensions menu. So we need some icon that's going to show up here. And also if we have the icon in any other place like the web store, that's also where it gets used. So we need to copy out our two lines here because it's the exact same two icons. You can make them different if you want, but we don't really care. So you just copy and paste that, no problem. Now, the only other thing we're going to define right now, we'll define some stuff later, is an options page. And that's going to be options.html in the HTML folder. So Chrome does a pretty cool thing, and it basically just lets you create your own little site that lets you put in different inputs and change different settings. And the way that we can get to our options page, let's actually, hold on. So I want to show you where the options page is, but we have to actually make these first, just so that Chrome knows that they do exist. The only things that we've referenced in here so far are options.html and popup.html. So we need to at least create those files, even if they don't have anything in them yet. And we don't have anything else. So we can actually load this in now. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to go into Chrome, and let's pretend I didn't have this open already. And the way that we can do this is by going into our little settings up here, and then we're going to go into more tools and then click extensions. So this is where all of your extensions are housed. You're not going to have these options up here by default. If you don't have these options, you just need to check the thing in the corner that says developer mode, because we're super cool people and we have special privileges. And then you'll get the option to load unpacked, which is how we load our extension into Chrome that we're making. So just find whichever folder you've defined it in, and you just want to select the whole folder with all the assets and HTML and everything inside of it. We'll select that and load it in. So it loaded in, no problem. We don't have any errors this week. We had lots of errors trying to load it in last week. So if you have any errors trying to load it in, raise your hands, yell them out. We can try and debug those. But now that it's loaded in, we can go ahead and use it. So if we go up to the corner here where this puzzle piece is, and then we click the pin, now we have our little icon up here. It's a moon for dark mode, which is super cool. And if we open this, it's just going to have a little white box, which means that it's successfully loading popup.html, but we haven't defined anything in there yet, so there's no content. If we want to get to the options page, what we can do is we can go into details here, and we can go to where it says extension options. And that brings us to our own HTML page, options.html, which again, we haven't put anything in there, so it's just blank. But we can use it for whatever we want. We can put in inputs to change certain parameters, which we will after we get to some of the content scripts, and then store them into Chrome storage. And that's how we can use those values in the rest of our application. Okay, super cool stuff. We are pretty much good on the manifest for now. I have so many mouses on this desk that I'm losing track of which one is which. Okay, so we need to actually define our HTML pages. Why is this so big? Okay, so we don't have anything in here yet, so let's just jump into it. The first one we're going to do is our popup.html. So again, we can put something in the corner. This is mostly review from last week, so we'll try and run through it a little bit quickly. But any HTML document needs to start with the tag doctype HTML, just to let the browser know that it is an HTML document that's looking at. And then we can put any sort of metadata information about the application. So not anything that actually is visible, but just kind of other things in our head tag. And then we also need a body tag, which we put the actual content. So content we need in this. We need a button to toggle dark mode on and off. We need a label that tells us if it is currently on or off. We need a bar that lets us adjust the intensity of how much we're making it dark, and then also a label that tells us how much that intensity is. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a div, which just lets us group things together. And we're going to group together the toggle button and the toggle description. And then we're also going to group together in a separate div the intensity information. So in this div, what we're going to do is we're going to create a button with an ID of toggle, because that's what it does. And the text inside the button is just going to say toggle. And then we're going to create an H2 here. And we're going to put in the H2, which just means a header of the second largest size. We're going to put enforce dark mode and space. So what we did last week is we went in and adjusted all of the text in this every time that the thing changed. And so we rewrote, enforced whatever, and then we changed what came afterwards, and we made the whole string new. So we're going to try something a little bit different, just so that we can only modify the one thing that we want to modify at a time. We're going to make a span. A span element just says there's some text in here. I want to do something special with just that text. So we're going to make a span, and the ID is going to be mode display. And the value inside the span is just going to be temp. We don't want to put anything in there yet. We don't know if it's on or off. We have to figure that out from our Chrome storage later on. But our span is non-visible by default. Just like a div just groups things, you can't see it unless you add properties to it. A span also just groups text, and it's invisible unless you add properties to it, which we will. And then we're going to create another div down here. And in this div, we're going to create a paragraph element, which is just some basic text. And we're going to put our intensity in here. And once again, we're going to create a span with ID of intensity display, so we can change only the current value and nothing else. And this is also temp because we don't know what it is yet. And then we're also going to be really nice to our users and give a recommended value. And as I was testing this out, I determined arbitrarily that 90 is a good thing. It looks pretty cool, so we're going to recommend 90. And then we also need to create the actual bar that someone can move to adjust the intensity. The way we're going to do that is we're going to create an input element, and the input is going to be of type range. So depending on what type we put in here, it gets literally a different kind of input. You could specify a number input, which only lets you type in numbers. You could specify a text input, which only lets you type in characters. Or if we specify certain things like range, it literally turns it into a whole different input element. So this is a bar that you can drag. And with the range element, there's a couple of things that we need. We need to specify what is the smallest value that this can go to. We need to specify what is the largest value this can go to. And we're going to use percentages, so 0 to 100. And then we can specify a step, which is what is each increment in the bar. And our increment is going to be 1%. And then in order to specify a default value that it will start at, we need to add the value tag. And we're going to start it at 90 because that's what we recommended. And since there's no content in this tag, we can just self-close it. If we put a little slash at the end of the opening tag, then we don't have to specify a closing tag. Since there's no content in it anyway, we don't have to do that for inputs. Okay, super cool. So we got all that. And then the only other thing we're going to do down here is we're going to specify a script tag. So we want to do a couple things on this pop-up. We want to adjust the labels on here when those values change. And then also we want to send this information to other functions of our extension. So we're going to need to insert some JavaScript. And we're going to use a file called the source folder and then popup.js. So this is saying go up one level from where we are in the HTML folder and then go into the source folder and popup.js. And from personal testing, you can't self-close a script tag. I don't know why. It's not like we're ever going to put anything in there, but you could actually put something in there, and I guess that's why they don't let you do that. So we have to specify a closing script tag. Okay, is everyone caught up with this so far that is actually following? Do you need more time with this up here? Okay, if you have any questions, just raise your hand. It's not like there's a whole lot going on in the screen. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna go up to our head up here. And this is where we would put our styles to make this web page look good. And we could do that. We could insert a style tag here and then put our styles in here. So like if we want to style the body, we select the body and then put our properties in here. But just to do things a little bit differently, we're going to put our styles in a different file. So what we're going to do is we're going to link to that file. And the file is a style sheet. And then we're going to put in an href, which just says, where is it? And our href could be to an actual web page. Like we could put in a URL here, and if it were somewhere online, it would get that. But since it's local, we're just going to specify the file path, which is up one level and then into the CSS folder. And we'll call it popup.css. And a link is a weird tag because it doesn't close at all. We don't self-close it. We don't specify a closing link. Nothing ever goes in it. So you don't even have to close it all. It's just the link. And we haven't created this yet. So that's the next thing we need to do. We need to create a popup.css. God, this is going to throw me off all night. I'm trying to grab the wrong mouse. Okay, so we're going to put a couple things in here to make it look better. Let's actually show you really quick what it looks like without any styles. So we can go back into Chrome and then we can reload our extension with this little reload button, or if we click update, it'll reload all of them. And if we go up here, it's functional. Everything we want is in there, but it's not very presentable and everything's kind of like small. We don't want it to be very small. So we're going to do a couple things to make this different. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to get the body tag, which means just the whole page. We're going to set the width to be 350 pixels. So our pop-up only by default is the width and height of the content inside and no larger, but we can specify a fixed width if we want to. We're going to specify a background color here, and we're going to use the color 2C2C2C, which is a hex code. And this is also arbitrarily chosen because I thought it looked interesting. So let's see what that did. If we reload and then open it again. So now our thing has a fixed width. It's not only as large as it needs to be. And then now the background is dark. But we can't read any of the text on here. You might not have even known that there is text on here on the projector, but it's a little more visible on my screen. And everything is off to the left. We don't want anything to be off to the left. We want everything to be right in the center. So we're going to throw a couple of other things in here. So in this little section, what we did is we selected our elements by just saying what element we want. And then we specified the properties that need to apply to every instance of that element. There's only one body though. So we can do the same thing, and we're going to apply stylings to both divs at the same time. We have two divs that group the top content and the bottom content, and we're going to do text align center. Text align does is it takes whatever content is inside and it just puts it horizontally centered. And now all of our things are centered, which is cool. And we still can't read anything, so let's put in a color property. And our color is going to be white. For basic colors, you can literally write out the color, but if you want like a specific shade, then you have to put in the code. But this selector just means grab every element, and the color property is really the text color. It just says color, but it applies to the text color. There is no text color property. And so now if we open it, we should be able to read it. I probably didn't save it, did I? No, I didn't. Very cool. Okay, now we can read everything, but now the button is wrong. So now we can't read anything on the button. So let's put a couple of other things in here. Let's select two things at once. Let's select the toggle element and then also our H2. So we can specify multiple elements with a comma in between. And this selector, the pound sign just says select something with this ID. We can also select by class by using period toggle. If there was a toggle class, we could do that. But this is selecting two things at once if we put the comma in between. If we take the comma out, then it's selecting an H2 that is in the other element, which we don't want. We just want to select both of these elements. And we're going to set the display the inline block. An inline block just means we can put multiple elements on the same line. So if we look at it without reloading, everything's on its own line. Actually, maybe it just reloaded automatically. That would suck. That would ruin my point. Okay, that's what I did. So now we can put multiple things on the same line if we want. We are going to put our toggle button and our label on the same line. And let's put a couple of other things on the toggle button. We're going to set the width to be 60 pixels and the height to be 60 pixels, just so it's a square. We can set a background color. And we could use a hex code for this. We could use like the literal written out color, but we can also specify an RGB value, which is pretty much the same thing as a hex code, but a little bit easier to read. And here we're going to specify 133, 132, and then 72. which is kind of like this slightly disgusting sewer water color, but it actually looks slightly better than I just described it. So that's why I chose that one. Once again, arbitrarily, we're going to text align center, which means put the text in the button in the very middle. And the last thing we're going to do is we're going to specify a margin right of 20 pixels. So the way we have it set up is our button comes first and then our label comes on the right. And we are saying put 20 pixels of space to the right of the button before whatever comes next is inserted. So let's take a look and see what that did. Copy this and reload. Okay, so now everything is readable in here. We have our button. Our button looks pretty okay. And then we have all of our other things and they look readable and presentable, which is great. You'll notice one glaring flaw. We still have the word temp in here, which is not super helpful. So the next thing we need to do is we need to actually replace that with the right value. The only way we can do that is by creating a JavaScript file that helps us get the right value and put it into the page. So we're going to create popup.js next. And our popup.js is where we're going to do all of the cool things related to this popup. So this is also not new from last week, but we're going to do a couple of things differently in here just to show you some variety in the way that we can write JavaScript. And then after this, I promise we'll get to the new stuff. But this is just, kind of boilerplate that has to be done first. Okay, so what we want to do first is we want to get a reference to all of the elements in the page that we actually care about. And what we care about is we care about the button because we need to listen for when the button is clicked so that we can do something. We care about the slider because, again, when the slider moves, we have to do something. We care about the span for the mode. We don't need the whole thing. We just need that little section in the span, which is why we put only temp in that span. We only care about this little section here. And then we also need this one. So we're going to get all four of those really quickly. We're going to define a variable for each one. And since there are no types in JavaScript that you have to write your variables, it's not statically typed, we can specify just a modifier. Constant means it's not going to change. The element's not going to suddenly become a different element. So if you can make something constant, absolutely do so. And the way we're going to get a reference to it is we're going to use the document. Document refers to the whole page, which is that little pop-up. And we're going to get an element by ID. So you'll notice that the toggle button, we specify an ID here of toggle. So we can put that string in. And now we will have a JavaScript reference to the element itself and all of the properties of that element, which is super cool. And we need to do that for everything else that we care about as well. So we also need to get element by ID for the mode display. So our mode display is this little span here. And we also need to get element by ID our intensity display. So our intensity display is the other little span here. And we also need to get this input. And we didn't specify an ID here. We absolutely could. We could put an ID on this just so we can figure out exactly what element we want. But once again, we're in the interest of doing some cool things just so that everyone can see what you can do with JavaScript. So we're going to select it a different way. We're instead going to use a query selector. So query selector lets you specify a selector the same way we can do with CSS. CSS, we specify selectors to determine which elements do we want to apply a style to. We can likewise with JavaScript put a selector in here and it will get all of the elements that match that selector. And there's two methods we can use. We can use query selector, which only gets the first thing it finds that matches. Or you can use query selector all, which returns an array of all of the things that match, which may be nothing. So in which case it would be an array of 0. But we only have one input that we're getting. So we're just going to query selector. And we'll query for the input element. Since we only have one input element, we know that it will get the right one.
So what's the point of using query selector?
It's just a different way of doing it. So if you want to put an ID on every single element, that's totally a good way of doing it. It lets you select specifically those elements. But if we wanted to do something with all of the paragraph elements. Like maybe we want to get all of the text on the page. We can query selector and put P in here. And if we query selector all, it will return an array of all of the paragraph elements and their properties. So in this case, it doesn't matter. We're just showing you that it exists, but there are legitimate uses for this. Okay, so we did that. And I named all of these the exact same thing, which is a terrible idea. Don't do that. And instead, we're just going to label them the same thing as what we're getting. And then we'll call this intensity bar at the bottom. Our intensity bar is the input slider at the bottom. Okay, so we need to manage our mode and our current intensity. And the way we do that is by defining variables. So these cannot be constant because they're going to change. So instead, we're going to use the let modifier, which just means we're creating a new variable. And we'll start mode as false, and we'll start intensity as 90. Because again, that's what we recommended. And we'll update these by getting them from storage eventually, but we haven't done that yet, so we can't initialize it like that. We're going to define a function here that lets us update whatever the spans are supposed to show based on the current value of mode and intensity. So we can call this function over and over again anytime those change and change our HTML page to display the correct values. So last week, what we did is we defined a function using the function keyword, and a function is just a piece of code we can call over and over again. And based on some inputs, it'll have some outputs. And we named our function update display, and we specified any parameters we have in here, which for this function, we don't care about any. And then we can specify the code on the inside. We're going to do it a little differently because, again, we're in the interest of doing fun things. And we're going to use more modern JavaScript syntax. So you can totally do this. This is correct JavaScript. It will never stop being correct JavaScript, hopefully. But what we're going to do instead is we're going to define an arrow function. So an arrow function, if you've ever heard of anonymous functions before, it's a function that does not have a name. And the reason why you do it is because it's shorter. And anytime we use a function that's only ever going to be used once, it doesn't make sense to declare a whole function and name it if we're only going to use it once. In this case, we're not actually going to only use it once, but we can still use arrow syntax if we want. So the way that we define an arrow function is by specifying parameters in here. So this is param1, param2, yada, yada, yada. And then we specify an equal sign and a right caret, I think that's called. And then we specify the code that we want to put in. And we're going to use this for the rest of the workshop. We're going to use this syntax. And we don't have to actually name this function at all. This function just exists. So you might ask, how do we call it then? In some cases, you won't have to call it because you're just specifying it as like, this is what I want you to do when this thing happens. But we do want to call this function more than once. We want to call this every time we make changes. So the way we can do that is we can assign the reference to this function to a variable. So this function exists. It just has a reference. It doesn't have a name, but we can assign a reference to this function to a variable. And anytime we call that variable, it will call the function that is stored in it. So we can define a variable called update display and assign this function to it. And we don't care about any parameters, so we'll take all of those out. And now we can get rid of this. These are functionally, no pun intended, the exact same thing. They do the exact same thing. We can call them the exact same one. So we're going to take out the old syntax since arrow functions are basically what people use nowadays for everything. And we're going to put some stuff in here. So we want to update those spans that we got, our displays, to house whatever the current value of mode and intensity are. And we'll call this function every time it changes. The way we do that is we want to change the text content of those elements. So the first element we got is the mode display, which again is a reference to this span. We're going to change the text content property to be our new text. And if mode is true, then we're going to make it on. We're going to put an extra space in here just so that it's the same number of characters for both. When you don't put the same number of characters, every time it changes, the sizing of the line gets bigger and smaller, and it looks like an accordion, which is a little bit strange. So just put an extra space there if you want. And that's all we have to do. Now it'll take whatever the value of mode is. And if it's true, it'll put it as on. And if it's false, it'll put it as off. And it'll put that straight into the span. And we can do the exact same thing with our other span, our intensity display here. And we'll set the text content to be whatever intensity is. JavaScript is kind of nice. It plays kind of loosey-goosey a little bit with types, which means we can, even though this is text content, we can put a number in here and it will just put the string that's the same number. We don't have to literally convert it into a string ourselves like we would in lots of languages where types matter. JavaScript will just do this for you. So we can literally just put a number in here, which is fine. Okay, so we did that. Let's call update display. Actually, I don't want to call this update display. Let's call this update labels, since that's what we're doing. We're updating each label. And we'll call this function at the bottom. So JavaScript is a scripting language, which means it just runs everything in the file from top to bottom. So what it's going to do is it's going to get a reference to all those things. It's going to create variables. It will create this function, and then we can call the function after we've already created it. So let's look at this and see what it does. If we go back into Chrome and we'll reload our extension here, if we open this, it will now change those temporary values to the actual values that we've defined in that JavaScript function, which is off by default and 90 by default, which is cool. But if I change these, like maybe I swap this slider to another value so that it's not 90, it always defaults to the exact same thing. So we want to change our default values first. And the way we're going to do that is by defining some other things. So we're going to put a couple of listeners on here to react to things that are happening. So JavaScript doesn't work the same way as some of those other big object-oriented languages where you have a main function and then it just runs through the code and you have a bunch of objects and do things with objects. Instead, what we do is it runs from top to bottom and we can add listeners which persist. So after the script gets to the bottom, the listeners will still be active. And when those listeners detect something that happens, those listeners call something that's going to then happen. It calls a function that does whatever we want as a result. So we need to define what listeners we want. The two things that we're listening for, if we go back in here, I'm going to open literally everything other than Chrome by accident. We need to listen for when this button is clicked. Right now, it doesn't do anything. We also need to listen for when this slider changes. So we're going to insert 2 event listeners. Technically 3, and I'll explain why 3 in a second, but we're going to do at least 2. Yes, this is a good point from Rob. So we can use query selector and select by ID, just like the same way we did in our thing here. We selected an ID. Any valid CSS selector works with query selector. Okay, small tangent aside, we need to actually put our event listeners in here. So the first one we're going to do is we're going to add an event listener to our button. The way we do that is we use our reference to the button element. And our button can then add event listener on top of it. So the button will listen for events. And this has 2 parameters. The first parameter is a string, which just says, what event do we want to listen for? And in this case, we want to listen for when the button is clicked with the click event. And then the second parameter is what function do we want to call when this thing happens? So we could specify a function out here and then put a reference to the function here. So we could call update label here. And we wouldn't put parentheses on here because we don't want this function to literally execute when this line is executed. Instead, we want to just give it a reference to whatever function we want it to call. And the listener will know, okay, I have this reference. I need to actually call the function at that reference. But we can also define a function inline. I'm so sorry. I'm going to get some water really quick so that I don't sound like a raspy creature the whole time. Okay. Oh, that sounded awful. Okay, here we go. So, like I was saying earlier, anonymous functions exist because sometimes you don't care about calling a function more than once. This is one of those cases. Our function that we're defining here is only ever going to run when this button is clicked, and it will never be run again in any other case. So it doesn't make sense to define a function, name it, and then put it in a variable. Instead, we can just define the function in line, because it's never going to use anywhere else. So we can use our arrow function syntax and define our function just right here. And this function, like we set up here, this basically creates a reference to a function with no name that does all the things, and then we put it into a variable. In this case, we're creating this function and it returns a reference again, but instead of putting it into a variable, we're just giving it directly to the listener. And there's a parameter in here that you could put in if you care about the details of the event. So you could get what was clicked, where was the click happening, things like that. But we don't actually care about any of that. As long as the button is clicked, we're going to do the same thing every time. So we're going to leave this out. We don't care about that parameter. Okay, so we did that. What happens when the button is clicked? Our mode changes, and we need to update our pop-up to reflect that. And then we also need to put it in storage so that our other content knows that our mode has changed. So the easiest one is by just changing the mode, and we're going to set mode to be whatever it currently is not. And we're also going to send this to storage. So Chrome has its own storage, which lets us sort of use it from lots of different places in our extension. So this script only exists in our pop-up, but we're going to create scripts that exist literally in the web page. And we have a script that exists in the options page. Those are totally separate. They can't communicate with each other. And the way that we communicate with each other is by putting things in storage, and other scripts can get whatever is currently in storage. So we're going to call chrome.storage.sync.set. There are two methods of chrome.storage.sync, set and get. Set, you put something in, get, you take something out. Pretty easy to remember. And what are we going to do? The first parameter here is what are we going to put in? And we specify an object with all the things that we want to put in. And an object in JavaScript is simply a collection of key value pairs, same as in our manifest.json, where we have keys and values. So our key that we're going to put in here is the mode key. So our key is, even though we have a variable called mode, this is literally just going to put it in as a string. And then we need to put, what do we want the value of this key in storage to be? And we're going to use the mode variable. You could name these something different. That probably is better practice, but I don't really care. So we did that. And then the second parameter that goes in here is what's going to happen at the end. You look like you have a question.
Yeah, so for where you're setting it, it'll automatically set the key to be a string regardless of if there's a variable.
Yes. So if for our key, like it doesn't make sense to put like an actual value in there. So it doesn't even look at the variable. It's just going to create a string key called mode. And the value, it'll take whatever variable exists and put it in there. If mode was not a variable, that would not work. It would be undefined. Okay, and the second parameter in here is what happens afterwards. So Chrome.storage is an asynchronous API, and it's going to run, it's going to do all of its things, and then it's going to come back to us when it finishes. We don't know when that happens. Asynchronous means it's going to just go as long as it needs to, and the rest of our script is going to keep going. It's not going to wait. So we can't write any code that depends on the result of this down below, because it's going to execute before it actually finishes. So anything that we want to do that depends on the result of an asynchronous operation, we need to put in the callback. And our callback is the second parameter here. And once again, it's just a function that we want to run when it's finished. So we're going to specify arrow syntax here, just to say we don't care about this function, like when it's named, it's only ever going to be used once. And there's no parameter here because it's setting something, so we're not getting anything back. And let's just go ahead and log that we did this thing. So we're going to log console.log is how you write to the console, the web console. And we're going to say we set the mode to be whatever mode currently is. And then the other things we need to do is we need to now update our pop-up so it visually reflects that change. So we'll call update label. And the other thing we're going to pencil in here is something we need to find a way to send this to content script. So we're going to eventually create a content script that will modify the things in the page. And we only want to do it if dark mode is turned on. So if dark mode changes, well, our script needs to find a new way to identify whether it's on or off. And so we need to find a way to send it to that script. And we'll talk about that later, but we're just going to leave it as a comment for now. You guys look like you're heading out.
Yeah.
Okay, no problem. I just, want to stop and let you guys take a second. Thank you for coming. I appreciate it. Okay. So we did that. What is next? Okay, so we have more listeners to add. We also need to add a listener to our bar up here. So right now we have a listener for this button and it turns it on and off, which is super cool. And it sets it to storage. And we know that the storage operation is successful and we can actually check that by checking our console. So we wrote console.log and we can check where the console is by opening it, by right-clicking on whatever HTML page this JavaScript is running in. It's running in our pop-up and clicking inspect. And this opens the developer console. There's lots of really cool tools here for literally anything you're doing with web development. And I can't talk about all of them because we're not going to use all of them. But one of the most important things is the console down here. So every time we click the button, let me actually make this window smaller just so that you can see both at the same time. So anytime we click the button, our console sends that update, which means we know that it actually worked. There's lots of other cool things in here. You can inspect what is the actual composition of this page using the Elements tab. Our console up here. Sources is where you can look at the files that are in the page. And then if you're working with some actual API calls and things that get back and forth with other scripts, then you can use the network to see when different calls are being made. But we're not going to touch that. So that's pretty cool. So now our button works, but we still need to make our slider actually update things. Right now, it doesn't update anything. So we're going to add some more listeners in here. We're going to add a listener to intensity bar. Add events listener. Once again, 2 parameters. First one, what event? Second one is what does it do? So we're going to listen for an input event. And actually, I'm going to kind of jump ahead a little bit. And we're going to actually create 2 listeners. So after some Googling when I was creating this, there's actually 2 different events that matter for your range input. The first one is the input event, which happens every time that the value of an input changes. And when you drag the bar, every single time the bar moves, the input changes, which means this event is going to be called. But if we went in Chrome storage and updated the value every single time the bar was dragged, even dragging from 97 to 40, that's literally going to update 57 times, which is way more than we need. So we only really want to do the actual value updating when they finish dragging. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to be using the change events. The change event only runs when they let go of the bar. And for this one, we do actually want to specify this parameter here because this parameter is going to let us get what the current value of the input is at any moment in time. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to set intensity equal to, and then we're going to do event dot target dot value. I call these different things. Let's actually call this event since that's what it is. It's a reference to the event that's happening. So if we log the console event here, let's take a look at what this looks like, just so we can see why we're getting target and value. We'll refresh this and we'll inspect here to open up our console once again. So what we're doing is we're logging that optional parameter. And if we drag this, because again, our input event is when it gets dragged, it's going to start spamming a lot of things. Again, we don't want it to spam a lot of things. We only want it to update when it has one specific event that happens. So Chrome is also really cool. And this extends to literally all browsers. It's not just a Chrome thing. In your console, it will actually log objects in a way that you can interact and see all the things in the objects and expand them, which is really interesting because it makes things a lot cleaner than trying to turn an object into a string and putting that string in the console. So you'll notice that if we open this event, which is just a reference to the event that's happening, there is a target, and that target is the input that the event is happening to. If we scroll all the way down here, there's a property for every single input called value. And we want to get this value, which is the current thing in the input. So that's why we're calling event.target.value down here. And then after we get that, we want to update our label. So our label just updates to whatever intensity currently is, and we're setting it to whatever the bar is currently at as it's being dragged. So let's try that. We'll reload our extension. And you'll see that our intensity value changes as we drag it, which is super cool. We're not writing it to storage, so we need to do that. And we're going to put that in our change event because we only want to write it to storage when they finish. So we're going to do in our change event down here, we're going to do another console.log of the events, just so that we can see the event that's happening. And then we're going to set intensity to be, once again, event.target.value. And we're going to do another chrome.storage.sync.set. So we're going to set the value in storage. And our first parameter is what do we want to set? We want to set something called, I'm going to make up a key. We're going to call it intensity again, just to keep the naming consistent. And we're going to set it to be whatever the value of the intensity variable is. Intensity, I cannot spell. And then we need to specify our function callback to say, once we've done this, what do we want to do? Well, let's first just log to show that we actually did it. Yes, I am still here. So we're going to console.log set intensity value to. We're going to call update label again, just now that they're finished, we'll give it a final value. And then we're also going to do the same thing that we did up here. Eventually, we want to send this value to other places, but we don't have a way of doing that yet. So we're just going to pencil in it. Okay, so that's really cool. And then the last thing we're going to do here is we're going to get whatever is currently in storage when we open the pop-up for the first time. So it won't just default to what our default values are. It's going to be what actually the user last specified these values to be. The way we do that is with chrome.storage.sync.get this time. And the two parameters for get are going to look very similar. The first one is what do we want to get? And we specify in an object what we want to get. And we can get multiple things at one time. We want to get both the mode and the intensity. We don't want to call get twice. We can just put them both in here. So we'll specify we want to get the mode. And the value for here is actually a default value. So if we don't find it, what do we want to put in there instead? And then intensity 90 will be our default. The callback here for get is really important because we want to get whatever is retrieved and then do something with it. So it all comes back in a bundled variable, which we're going to call retrieved arbitrarily. A lot of arbitrary things being decided here. And then what we're going to do is we're going to first console.log, what did we get back? Just so that we can see it. And then we're going to set mode equal to retrieved.mode, and intensity is, I cannot spell this to save my life. Retrieved.intensity. And then we'll call update label here. And theoretically we'll be good. So let's see what this does. Let me refresh it first. So it defaults to whatever we had last. So we had it on last. If we toggle it off and then close it and reopen it, it'll open as off. If we turn it on, close and reopen, it'll start it as on, which is super cool. If we inspect it, we can see that it's actually getting the right value. So this is our retrieved object that we're logging. There are two values, what it gets for mode and what it gets for intensity. And then we can set the intensity to something different. So let's set it to 37, and 37 is what gets logged because that's our change event. And if we close this and reopen, you'll notice that it starts at 37. There is a problem here. this bar does not look like 37% out of 100 to me. This looks like 90%. And the reason why it looks like 90% is because in our popup.html, we specified the value to always start at 90. So we also need to literally go into our elements and set the bar to be at the right position so that everything lines up correctly. The way we're going to do that is we're going to call intensity bar, and we'll set the value property to be whatever our intensity is. Save and reload that. Now, when we open this up, 37, the bar is 37% full. So that looks a lot better. Okay, that is all we're going to do with popup.js for now. We haven't even touched the content script, which is the biggest part of what we're actually going to do here. So that is the next thing on the docket. And our content script is basically a script that we're going to physically insert into the web page. And it's going to pretend like that web page had that script the whole time. So what we did in our popup.html is we specified which script do we want to include in here. But we can write a script that is going to go in someone else's web page and do whatever we want to do, which sounds really nefarious, but you can do some really cool things with it. And the way we do that is by defining which content scripts we want to actually run. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to go back into our manifest.json and we're going to specify a content scripts key here. And our content scripts is not an object, it's actually going to be an array because we could have lots of different content scripts. We're only going to create one, but we could have several. And each content script is going to be defined by an object with a couple of different properties that give information about how it's going to work. So the first thing is, bless you, we need to specify a matches property. So which pages do we want to insert this into? And we're going to use Chrome's version of pattern matching. And we can match it against a lot of different things, which means it's an array. We could put multiple things in here. We could put google.com, and then every time we go to google.com, this will show up. We could put any other website in here, but we can also specify a general URL that anything that matches that general URL is going to have this script inserted into it. And we want to do it for every single page. If we had an extension that only ran on like YouTube or only ran on Gmail, then we would put a specific URL in here. But because we want to run it on everything, we're going to specify the universal URL. So what this is saying is we're going to split our URL into 3 parts. The first part is our protocol. So if you connect to a web page, it's usually going to be HTTP or HTTPS. But there's also different protocols for like getting a file from your computer and loading that into Chrome. And a star just means 0 or more characters. We don't care what the characters are. And then domain, again, we don't care what it is. And the path after the domain, we don't care what it is. So this is going to run literally every time we go to a new site, which is what we want. Next, we need to specify what is the script we're going to insert. And we can do that with a JS property. And we can insert multiple scripts here. We don't have to just insert our one script. We could insert as many scripts as we want. So that's why it's an array. And the first thing we're going to insert is a script that we're going to write called darkencontent.js. And our darken content is going to rely on that script that I mentioned way at the beginning called tinycolor, which is a library I found on GitHub. And tinycolor has to exist in the page before our script knows how to use it. So tinycolor actually needs to come first, and we need to insert that into the page so that our script can go ahead and use any functions defined in that script. So we already put tinycolor in here. If we actually open that up, tinycolor is just like a bunch of really useful functions we can use. There's a function called isLight, which determines if something is over a certain lightness threshold. And there's one for isDark, something to make a color darker, something to make a color lighter. Those are the 4 we're going to use. And there's lots of other cool things you can do in here. The way that they determine light and dark is by HSL values, HSL being another way of representing colors. Most of the time with computing, we represent them as red, green, and blue, and just like, you know, up to 0 to 255 of each. But HSL instead is hue, shade, and lightness, which means that we can use the same hue and shade and change the lightness. So it's the same color, it's just lighter or darker, which is what we want. We want to make the same color darker to put it in dark mode. Okay, so we did that. We specified what all we're going to put in here, and my mouse may or may not be dead, which is very cool. So I'm just going to throw that one out for now. Okay, so we did that. There's one other thing we want to specify in here. So this is an optional property, and we're going to put run at document end. Run at is something that I discovered on the documentation. It basically determines when is this script going to be inserted. So there's 3 different properties we can put in. We could put document start, which means the document has just been loaded in. It hasn't applied any of the styling information yet, which is not what we want. We want all the styling information to be applied. And then after that, we look at the colors and determine if it needs to be darker or lighter. So we're not going to use that. We use document idle, which basically just lets Chrome figure out when is a good time. And then document end, which means literally everything has been loaded. All the styles are finalized. And now we're going to insert our script. Because it depends on everything being finalized and all the colors being correct, we want to put it as document end. Okay, that was a lot. But this content script is now ready to go. It just hasn't been created yet. So we're going to create a new darken content.js file. Our darken content is going to have a couple of interesting things that we're going to do to everything. So remember, this script is going to be, the term that Chrome uses is inject, which I think is probably my favorite computer science word of all time, just because it sounds so nefarious, but it's the same thing as saying insert. It's going to be injected into the page, and now can use everything in the page the same that we did with our other JavaScript file popup.js, where we just got a reference to the elements and we changed things about the elements. We can do the exact same thing about literally any web page now, which is a lot of freedom. We can do a lot of cool things. So that being said, what we're going to do is we're going to create 2 variables here. We're going to set our mode to be false, and we're going to set our intensity to be 90. And eventually we're going to get the actual values of these, but we don't have a way of doing that yet. So we're just going to set these to be defaults. And we are going to, actually, we're going to set this to be true, because if we set it to be false, then it's not going to apply everything. And we want to at least see if it works or not. And now we're going to define our function that actually changes all of the things in the page to be dark mode. So we're going to define a function. We're going to make it an anonymous function again. And we're going to also put a parameter in here called reason, which we're not going to use yet, but we are going to use in the future, at which point we will go ahead and actually tie it into the function. And let's put a log statement here just to make sure that this is actually running at the right time that we want to. And we can make this literally anything, trying to run content script. And this will just let us know in the console, is this the actual thing? Is it running at the right time? Okay, and then so basically the process that we're going to follow here is we're going to get all of the elements in the page. We're going to determine if they are light elements. And if they are light, we're going to make them dark. Relatively straightforward. And you'll see how we're going to do that in a second. So we're going to use constant all elements. So we're going to create a variable that's going to hold all of our elements. And you remember that we talked about the query selector earlier. So at that time, we query selected an input element, and we only got 1. But what we can do here is we can do a query selector all, which means get all of the elements matching the selector. And we want to get literally every single element. So our selector is going to be that star, which means everything. Okay, so we did that. And now what we can do is we can loop through these elements one at a time and go ahead and change them. So we'll use a for loop. And we could use a standard for loop syntax where we create an iterating variable I and then go to the end of the thing. Or we can use sort of like shorthand for just process everything in here. If you ever used Java before, there's a for each loop, which is pretty easy. And there are for each equivalents in JavaScript. And one is by specifying a name for whatever element you're currently processing by let something. And then we need to specify what are we iterating through with the keyword of, and then all elements. Let's actually console.log all elements here, just so that we can see what this query selector actually returns. And we're not going to log anything here. So let's run this function here, which is called run. And let's try and see if we can see what's actually happening. So we're going to reload this. So now every time I go to a new page, that script is going to run on that page. So they just open up, I'm going to open up web courses just because it has a lot of white to it, which helps us see everything that's happening. And again, we can inspect this specific page by right-clicking and clicking inspect. And we see a couple things here. So it prints, we're trying to run the content script, which means it has been successfully inserted into this page. And then you'll see that we get 360 different elements back, which is a lot. It doesn't actually take that long to run through each of them, but we do need to process each one, which is why we use our for each loop. So we know that our query selector worked. So now in here, we want to process each element at a time. So this elem now has a reference to a single element for each loop. And we're going to create a new variable called computed, and we're going to call window.getComputedStyle and pass in elem. Lots of things to talk about here. So over here, we have the term document, which refers to the whole HTML page and functions that you can do with that page. Window likewise references the whole browser window. What do we want to do with it? And so window can get computed styles on a page. And the difference, why we would call get computed styles, the other thing that we could do is we could call elem.style. This doesn't have the right effect. So if we call elem.style, what it's going to do is it's going to get all of the styles that are directly applied to this in this document. So if we specified styles at the top, it would apply those. Or if we specified a style attribute literally on the element, which we can also do, it gets very messy very quickly. It would get those and we would be able to use those values. However, the way that most websites work, and the same thing we did for our pop-up, is by linking to external style sheets where you can organize all of your style sheets in one place and make them look pretty. And then you don't have to worry about like making your HTML file really, really big. So anything that's linked to externally is not going to be retrieved by this elem.style call. Instead, what we have to do is we have to call getComputedStyle, which means after every single CSS selector has been loaded and all of the properties have been applied, it will compute, the browser computes which one is actually going to show based on which has precedence or any math operations. And then the computed style is what is actually showing. And you can see the difference between this by if we click on this thing here and we go into styles, you'll notice that it has styles from a lot of different places. Let me actually make this a little bit bigger for you guys. So these styles apply from a lot of different places. So some of them they inherit from other properties. So like it has a bunch of this random div that we selected has a couple of properties from body. It has a couple inherited from the HTML page itself. There's some that have been linked to from other places. There's some that apply to the classes that it's a part of. There's a lot of things that go into determining what is the actual style that we're going to see. So we want to get computed, which gets after all of that has been decided, what is the thing? What is the user seeing? Okay, and now we're going to do the actual darkening. So we're going to define a constant variable called BC, background color, and we're going to call tiny color. And the reason why we're going to do this is because that's just how tiny color told me that you need to call it. If we go into the GitHub repo here, if this actually loads. Usually if you use a GitHub library, they'll have lots of documentation in the README about how to use it. So we can call tiny color and then pass in a value and it'll get its own internal representation. And then we can call methods from there. So we're going to get tiny color and we're going to get computed.background color. As you'll notice again, if we go back into popup.css, in CSS, when we want to specify a background color, we'll call this the property that it actually should be. It has a hyphen in between, but we can't use hyphens in JavaScript. It doesn't really work because they'll think it's a minus sign and things will go badly. So instead, anything that's usually hyphenated in CSS and JavaScript is camel case. And so we're going to get the background color of whatever this element is. And this should not be computer, this should be computed. We're going to check if BC, which is the tiny color representation of this, is light. That is a function that tiny color has defined. And if we look for what it is light is the inverse of is dark. And it basically just picks a threshold that HSL has defined for if something is technically light or if it is dark. And we're going to do something if it's too light. So if this thing has a background that's too light, we're going to make it dark. So we're going to make a variable called darkened bc.darken intensity. So whatever color we had, we're going to make it darker, and by how much, whatever our intensity value is. And now we can go ahead and assign that right back into the element. My element.style.background color is equal to our variable darkened. So when you're setting values, using style is totally appropriate and the right way to do it. If you're getting something, you always want to get the computed value. Just something to remember. I don't expect that you guys actually will remember that, but you will probably come across it in the future if you keep doing this. Okay, so this got the background of all of our elements. We can actually run this and see what it does. And we'll notice a little bit of a problem. We reload this page. Makes everything dark, which is super cool. And everything is a darker version of the same color. However, you'll notice that there's a lot of icons on the side here, and there's a lot of text over here, and we can't read any of that because there's no contrast. Are you stretching or you have a question? Okay. So there's no contrast. So basically, we also need to get all of our text elements and make them lighter by comparison. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to copy this because we're going to use basically the exact same code, but just slightly differently. I'm going to delete the extra line in here. We're going to change some things. So this variable is going to be called color. And what we're going to do is we're going to get computed.color. So again, color we said earlier is basically just the text color. There is no text color property. Instead, color is text color. I don't know why they did that, but they did. And we're going to check if the text color is dark. And if it is dark, we're going to create a lightened value of it by calling the lighten function. And again, we're going to lighten it by whatever our intensity is. And then we'll set the color of the element to be our lightened value. So I guess I shouldn't have copied it because we changed almost everything. But what we're changing is we're getting the element, getting the text color. If the color is dark, then we're going to make it light. And then we'll put it back into the text color of the element. So let's see what that does. We will reload, and then we will reload this page. Did this actually do anything? I think it technically did something. Okay, so there's no errors, which means that it did actually work. It's not as visible as I would have thought. Let's try going into Notion and see if that looks a little different. Okay, so in Notion by default, everything is white with black text, but we've inverted these things here to black with white text. You'll notice some things don't update. Anything that loads in after the fact is not going to update because it didn't exist when our script ran. So eventually we'll need to create a way to actually go back and make that darker as well, but we can't do that right now. We're going to do that shortly. Okay, so back in here, the only other thing that I want to do is I want to go through and find any icons that exist and make those lighter as well. So any icons that are in black are no longer going to be visible if our background is black, so we'll make it white. So what we're going to do is we're going to get everything that has a fill property. And if that fill property is dark, we're going to treat this like text. So if the fill is dark, we'll make the fill lightened. Then we'll go ahead and set element.style.fill is equal to lightened. So what if we didn't so what happens if an element doesn't actually have one of these properties? Well, computed will still give you back a value, but that value will essentially be nothing, which means our thing will still do the computations, but it won't actually treat it as light or dark. And it'll basically skip over anything that doesn't already have these properties, which is what we want. We only want to set the background of things with a background color to be a lightened version of it. And same for fill and darkness. So we can actually see this one in action too if we go to web courses. We said earlier that that little bar on the right has a bunch of icons here that are normally black. And now that we've set our fill to be light, these are SVGs, which is basically how you make icons that scale. They're basically just like a collection of points on a line. And now we've set the fill of all of these icons to be white. So now we can actually see those, which is pretty cool. So our page here is technically in dark mode. Like everything on here is technically dark. The courses are not dark because, again, they loaded in after the fact, which means our thing ran before they actually were in. But we can go back and redo everything. We're going to do it with a sort of hacky solution that I would not recommend in the future, but we're going to do it at least because it's relatively simple and doesn't require a whole lot of thinking. But it would be a good exercise to go find a better way of doing this in the future. So what we're going to do is we need to get whatever the actual values of mode and intensity are. At the very top of this file, we just set something. We didn't get it from anywhere, but we have everything in storage. So we need to go into storage and try and find those values and put them in the script here for when it runs. And the way we're going to do that is by making a function that goes and does that. So we'll call this function get settings. We'll use the anonymous function syntax again. And we're going to put our parameter in here called init, which basically just means, is it running for the first time or is it running again in the future? And what our run function down here, we'll set this to true. So init will be true when we run it for the first time. If we call this function from somewhere else, we won't put a value in, which means it won't be true. Okay, so we're going to do a chrome.storage.sync.get. Once again, first parameter is everything we want to get. So we're going to get our mode. And we can get multiple things at once again. So we're going to get our mode and we're going to set the default to be false. We don't want to apply it unless we know that they are in study mode. And we'll get our intensity as well, which will also default to 90 as usual. And then we're going to create our callback function here with the result of what we get back. Our result has the mode and intensity bundled in it. I'm going to indent these just so it looks pretty. And here's what we're going to do. We're going to set mode equal to result.mode. And we're going to set intensity equal to result.intensity. All right. And then, so we can do this and we'll go ahead and call the run function again after we change these values. So it reruns everything. And if we run this, let's first set this to false. Sorry, Notion makes my computer run very slow sometimes. So let's set it to false and we'll reload here. So if it's false, our run function is not going to do, actually it is going to do something. Let's actually fix that really quick. So right now our run function just runs regardless. We want to put a condition in here to only run if mode. And if mode is not true, then we'll just return out of the function. We won't run anything. So now that we have that and we reload, anytime you adjust a script, you have to reload. The script does not update automatically, so you have to reload your extension. So it's off by default, which means if we go into web courses, it's not going to try and do anything. But what I lied to you, I guess. What did we do? Oh, right, because this needs to have a default value of false. We set it to true originally because we didn't actually have a real value and we just wanted to see it work. But now that we have a real value, we're going to default it to false unless we get something else. Okay, try this again. So it's off, we reload, and then we'll pretend we're loading this up for the first time. So if mode is off, it's still light mode, which is pretty cool. And we can open this up and turn it on. And now if we reload, all right, well, that was anticlimactic. Maybe this doesn't actually work yet. So the one thing that we haven't applied here, oh, you know what it is? So I defined this function get settings, and then I didn't actually do anything with it, which is very cool of me. So we're going to call get settings down here with the value true, meaning that we're running it for the first time. And now when the page loads, it'll run it. So again, we're going to set this to off just so we can see the change. And so if we load this up, it will not work. And if we set this to true, we'll have to reload it again so the script gets reinserted. And now it changes it to dark mode. And you'll notice that it's not the same darkness that we had because we have an updated intensity value. Our intensity value right now is 37, which means it's not going to darken it by much. It's not going to lighten things by much. This looks kind of like garbage, not going to lie, which is why I put it at 90 because I think 90 looks much, much better. So we're going to put it back pretty high over here. Now, if we reload, it will actually be what we want. Okay, super cool. So we would be done here. Like this is pretty cool. It does the thing we want. Any page we go to, it'll make it dark and we can change the intensity in the mode. We're gonna put a couple of extra things in here just for quality of life changes that make it a little bit more interesting. So the first thing we're gonna do is we're going to put something in here that we're not gonna use yet, but I'm gonna put in here because otherwise I'm gonna forget. So we're gonna put a piece of code in here that is going to basically determine if we are currently on a page and we're changing it from dark mode to light mode. So what this is saying is we're going to get a variable and it's a Boolean expression. If the mode is currently dark mode and the mode we're changing it to is light mode, basically we want our extension to reload the page so that it reloads as light. And we don't have a way of actually doing this yet because our pop-up can't get those updates, which we're going to figure that out in a second. But we at least want to put this in here just before we do that so that it actually does something when it works. And what we're going to do is we're going to, if back to light mode is true, which means if we're swapping back to light mode, then we're going to send a window confirmation message. I cannot speak. Our message is going to be reload the page to remove darkness. And this is basically just a pop-up that shows at the very top of the window and asks our question, and then it's a yes or a no, a confirm or don't. And if they confirm, if they hit the confirm button, that will return true, at which point we are going to location.reload, which is, according to Google, the way that we reload the page. So we're not going to actually use this yet because we don't have any way of determining when this happens. But we are going to use it very shortly once we actually find a way to pass updates from the pop-up directly into the content script. And the reason why we want to do that is because right now, if we make a change up here, it's not automatically changed in the documents. We have to reload it so that the script gets reinserted and then, gets the updated value from settings. But we don't want to do that. We just want it to get the updated value directly, and then we don't have to reload the page. It'll just apply things. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to do something called message passing. So there's basically two ways of communicating between scripts. The first way is by putting things in storage and then having other scripts just check storage, whatever currently in there. The second way is by literally passing an active value between two scripts that are running. So there's no like waiting, you're putting something in storage and then waiting until something accesses it, which could be who knows when. It will literally get passed immediately, and then we can use that value immediately. One thing I'm going to put down here really quick before we get into the message passing is add event listener for the document. And if we click on the document, we're going to run a function. That function is going to run click. So what we're doing here is we're basically saying we want to rerun our documents all over again if we click on the page. And basically what that solves is if we open this here, this hadn't been loaded when the script was darkened for the first time. So now what happens is if we update this and we'll load in into the page. So it's currently in dark mode. And if we open this, now, because we clicked on here, it reran our code to make everything darker. And if we click anywhere on the page, it will run it again and again and again. So now the text is white, which is very high contrast comparatively to the blue. So every time we click, it will rerun it on any elements that are currently haven't been applied darkness yet. That was a real sentence. Okay, so that's cool. So let's get back to the message passing, because the message passing is the other really cool thing that I want to demo, just so you guys can see what's going on. I have way too many tabs open here, so I'm going to close some of them. Okay. What time? 6:40. Okay, we're probably not going to get into the options page. The options page is not super necessary. Maybe we'll copy that at the last second, but we can at least get through the message passing before 7, and then we'll call it from there. Okay, so what are we going to do? We're going to go into our message passing as we basically need two ends. So we need our end that is going to send a message, and we need an end that's going to take a message. The end that sends the message is going to send data over about something that happens. And then the end that takes the message is going to use that data to do something cool. So our darkened content is what's going to receive it, and the pop-up is going to be what sends it. The message we're sending is we change the values of the settings, rerun it with those new settings. So we're going to set up the listener on darkened content first, which is going to listen for the message. Chrome.runtime.message, on message, add listener. Not add event listener, just add listener. Add event listener is for HTML elements. Chrome things just use add listener for some reason. So one parameter here, and the parameter is basically everything related to the message that it receives. So there's 3 things we can specify here. We can specify a message, a sender, and a function that we can call to send a response back afterwards. Those are the 3 parameters of this function we're going to define in the listener. And we're only going to use the first one. So the first one is the actual message we're passing. And this is basically going to look for, is this the right message that I want to listen for? And if it is, do something. We can also verify which, what process is sending it, but we're not going to use that. And we can also specify where, like, send a response back with the send response function. We also don't care about sending anything back to the pop-up, so we're not going to use that either. So let us first console log that we received message. We'll put a quote in there just so that it appears as a string in the log. I can spell. Okay, so we'll log just to see that we're actually receiving things correctly. And if our message is the string update settings, I'm going to call get settings again, which retrieves whatever the new value is in settings. And then after that, I have a call in here to run, but we don't even need to do that because get settings calls run after it finishes. So we can just only call get settings. So basically what we're saying is if we get an update from the pop-up, that means we have to refresh our settings, call the function that gets those, and then run it again. So we did that. Can we run it? I think, actually, we can't run it because we don't have anything that sends the message yet. So we're going to go back into popup.js. So our popup.js is, again, what's running literally in the popup. And we're going to define it up at the top above the other listeners, just arbitrarily, it can go anywhere. And we're going to define a function called send update request. This function is going to, when it's called, pass that message to our other script. We'll use an anonymous function again. There's no parameters we need for this function, so we're not going to specify any. And so we need to call the chrome.tabs.sendMessage function, which of course sends the message. And there's parameters in here. So the first parameter is what tab do we actually want to send the message from? Or actually, sorry, what do we want to send the message to? Which tab do we want to send it to? Because we can send it to one tab specifically. And we don't have a way of doing this yet, so we'll talk about that in a second. Then the second thing is, what is the message we want to pass? We'll pass the string update settings. We could put a JavaScript object in here. If we wanted to pass actual data, we could totally do that. But we're only going to pass a string called update settings. And then the last thing we're going to put in here is a response variable. The callback function for that response. And we're going to do some error catching in here. So I found some errors when I was making this demo, that sometimes if you try and send a message, but the end isn't set up yet. So if our content script hasn't finished running, then it'll cause an error because there's no one to receive it. So we need to check if there's an error. And if so, we're basically just going to ignore it. We're going to log the response to the console. So this is just defining an alternative behavior for if we get the error that's not crash our program majestically. And we need to specify a tab in here. And the way we're going to do that is we need to figure out what is the current tab they have open that the content script is running in. The way we're going to do that is we're going to call a Chrome API function called chrome.tabs.query. If you wanted to figure out how to do this, Google is an excellent resource. I've just done all the Googling already, which is why I'm pulling these out of a hat. And there's two things that we need to specify in here. So the first thing is properties about the tab we're looking for. And we're looking for the active tab. And we're looking for the current window that is open. So this tab has to be in our current window and it has to be active. Our second thing is a function callback. Sorry, messing up the syntax here. So our function callback for once we get it back has a variable which has all the matching tabs. And we're going to insert this send message into here, right in the middle. And we're going to call tabs 0.id. Okay, so this works theoretically. And what it's going to do is it's going to, when we call it, get the current tab that's open, and then it's going to send a message to that tab of update settings. Okay, so we need to call this function. So there were a couple of comments in here. We're going to replace it where we commented earlier. All right, send update request. What else do we have to do in here? Mostly just options. Okay, so this is now completed, and I'm going to put one other thing in our darkened content really quick. So we're going to go up to the run here. We're gonna make another call here for if reason is equal to click. And actually, this doesn't make any sense because we're not doing options. We're gonna leave the options out. Just because everyone is already out of here anyway, and we're pretty much close to 7. Okay, theoretically, that should be everything. I'm gonna run this just to see if it works. So let's set this to off by default. We'll load up web courses. All right, so it doesn't work. And now if we change something in here, it will send the message automatically. So we got so received the message. Oh. All right, gotta make sure it's the same message. All right, just gonna demo this really quick and then we'll wrap up. Okay. So now message gets sent and it does it automatically. We open this, go ahead and click. All right, everything works, super cool. Only other thing that you can put in here is you can specify some options in the options page and use those options, but we're gonna skip that. All right, I don't know who's still here. No, you're still here. Awesome. Thank you for sticking around. And that's pretty much it. So I'm gonna stop sharing. Thank you, everyone. And as always, send me questions as needed.